Step away from the vehicle.
Good morning. Is there a problem?
You match the description of a target in an active immigration operation.
I'm Judge Marcus Ellison. This is my home. Do you have a warrant?
Turn around.
No warrant, no detention.
They thought it was just another routine pickup in a quiet Maryland suburb. But within minutes of snapping handcuffs onto a black federal judge in his own driveway without a warrant, the agents involved had set in motion an investigation that would dismantle their careers and shake the foundations of their field office. At 6:02 a.m. on a cool Sunday morning in Bethesda, the streets of Maple Ridge Court were silent, the kind of silence that settles over affluent neighborhoods before sunrise, when sprinklers tick softly and porch lights still glow against the fading dark. In the driveway of a brick colonial at the end of the cul-de-sac, Judge Marcus Ellison, 52 years old, stood beside his black Mercedes SUV loading a garment bag into the back seat. For 9 years he had served on the United States District Court for the District of Maryland, appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, entrusted with cases involving constitutional rights, federal enforcement actions, and questions of due process that shaped real lives. That morning there was no robe, no bench, no courtroom authority surrounding him. He wore dark jeans, a navy quarter-zip pullover, and running shoes, reading glasses resting on his head, a travel mug balanced on the roof of his vehicle. He was heading to Reagan National Airport for a judicial symposium where he was scheduled to speak on the limits of executive enforcement power. Everything about the scene was ordinary. A man preparing to travel. A quiet neighborhood. A routine morning. At 6:05 a.m., 3 unmarked black SUVs turned onto Maple Ridge Court without signaling and rolled to a stop directly in front of his driveway, blocking his vehicle completely. 6 agents in tactical vests marked IC exited in formation. The lead officer, Supervisory Agent Daniel Rourke, 44 years old and 16 years in a federal enforcement, approached with his jaw set and his hand resting near his holstered sidearm. "Step away from the vehicle," he called out sharply. Ellison turned slowly, both hands visible, confusion flickering across his face, but not fear. "Good morning," he replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" Rourke didn't answer the question. "You match the description of a subject in an active immigration enforcement operation. I need identification. Now." Ellison set his jacket down carefully on the bumper. His voice remained measured, the tone of someone accustomed to controlling tense courtrooms. "I'm Judge Marcus Ellison, United States District Court. This is my home. Do you have a warrant?" Rourke's expression tightened. "Turn around. If you're going to detain me," Ellison continued, calm but firm, "you need a warrant. You are on private property. What is the basis for this stop?" Rourke stepped closer. "I don't need to debate law with you. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Across the street, a porch light flicked on. A curtain shifted in a second-floor window. A retired Navy commander named Harold Finch opened his front door, drawn by the sound of engines and raised voices. Ellison did not raise his voice. "I am a sitting federal judge," he said clearly. "You are making a serious mistake." What happened next unfolded in less than 10 seconds, but would be replayed for months. Rourke grabbed Ellison's right arm and spun him toward the SUV. Another agent seized his left wrist. The movement was abrupt and forceful. Ellison's shoulder struck the side mirror of his own vehicle with a dull crack. The travel mug fell from the roof and shattered on the driveway. "Stop resisting," one of the agents barked. Ellison was not resisting. His hands were open, his posture compliant. The metal cuffs snapped tight around his wrists. Finch stepped onto his lawn in slippers, phone already raised, recording. 2 houses down, constitutional law professor Dr. Alana Green stood frozen on her porch before pulling out her phone and dialing 911. "I am Judge Marcus Ellison," he repeated as they pressed him against the hood of his own car, the metal cold beneath his cheek. "You do not have a warrant." Rourke ignored him. "Search the vehicle." The rear hatch was open without consent. His suitcase was pulled out and unzipped on the driveway. Shirts, ties, and folded suits were handled and moved aside. A leather briefcase was removed from the passenger seat. "You do not have authorization to search that," Ellison said steadily. The briefcase was opened anyway. Inside were sealed federal case documents stamped with court identifiers, a judicial identification badge bearing the seal of the United States courts, and official credentials with his photograph and title. One of the agents held up the badge. "Sir," he said quietly toward Rourke. Rourke took it, studied it for a moment, the silence hanging heavy in the cool morning air. The photo matched. The seal was authentic. The name was unmistakable. Across the street, Finch's voice carried as he narrated into his phone, ensuring every detail was captured. They've cuffed him. He told them who he is. They're searching anyway. For a brief moment, something shifted in the posture of the team. A pause. A recognition. But instead of ordering the cuffs removed, Rourke handed the badge back and said flatly, "Continue the search. IDs can be forged." Ellison closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his voice steady despite the metal cutting into his wrists. "You are now knowingly violating federal law." The agents emptied his briefcase onto the truck. Sealed documents fanned out in plain view of neighbors who had begun stepping on his sidewalks and lawns, phones raised, red recording lights blinking. The quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a stage. At 6:14 a.m., still cuffed in his own driveway, Judge Marcus Ellison stood surrounded by federal agents who had arrived at the wrong address, ignored his identification, and chose an escalation over verification. And in those irreversible minutes, before supervisors were called, before investigations were opened, before headlines were written, the careers of the agents on Maple Ridge Court were already collapsing, even if none of them knew it yet. Within 2 hours of the handcuffs coming off in that quiet cul-de-sac in Bethesda, the machinery of federal accountability had already begun turning, and the agents who had stood in Judge Marcus Ellison's driveway were about to discover that this was no routine field encounter that could be papered over with a few carefully chosen words in an incident report. At 6:17 a.m., after 12 tense minutes that felt far longer, Supervisory Agent Daniel Rourke stepped away to make a call to his field supervisor, pacing near the lead SUV, one hand pressed against the back of his neck as neighbors continued recording. When he returned, his tone had shifted from aggressive to clipped and controlled. "There's been a misidentification," he said flatly as he unlocked the cuffs. "You're free to go. No apology. No explanation." Judge Ellison straightened slowly, rolling his shoulders as the blood returned to his hands. Deep red impressions from the cuffs circling his wrists like brands. He looked at the scattered contents of his suitcase, the sealed court documents exposed across the trunk of his car, the shattered remains of his coffee mug on the concrete, and then directly at Rourke. "This was not confusion," he said, his voice calm but edged with something colder than anger. "This was a decision." The SUVs pulled away at 6:24 a.m., tires humming softly as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But the scene they left behind was already spreading beyond Maple Ridge Court. Retired Commander Harold Finch uploaded his recording to a private veterans group chat before forwarding it to a former colleague now working at the Pentagon. Dr. Alana Green emailed her footage to the dean of her law school with a single subject line: "Unlawful arrest of sitting federal judge, video attached." Judge Ellison, ice pack pressed to his shoulder inside his kitchen, made one measured phone call to the chief judge of his district. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. He recited the facts. By 8:05 a.m., the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts had been notified. By 9 a.m., the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General had opened a preliminary inquiry. By 10:30 a.m., the matter had been referred to federal prosecutors for review. Back at the ICE field office in Maryland, Rourke sat in a fluorescent-lit conference room drafting the official account. His report described an evasive subject who refused to comply with lawful commands and physically tensed and pulled away, requiring temporary restraint for officer safety. There was no mention of the judicial credentials, no mention of the sealed case files, no mention of the neighbors recording from multiple angles. He characterized the search as consensual based on officer safety concerns. 2 other agents added electronic signatures. A third agent, 29-year-old Officer Luis Mendez, hesitated. He had stood 3 feet away when Ellison calmly identified himself. He had watched Rourke examine the judicial badge. He had heard the order to continue searching anyway. "This isn't accurate," Mendez said quietly. Rourke leaned across the table, lowering his voice. "Sign it. It's a standard encounter. Don't complicate your career over paperwork." The room fell silent. Mendez signed. But that evening, alone in his apartment, he replayed the footage in his mind. The calm voice, the compliance, the cuffs tightening, and dialed the Inspector General's whistleblower hotline, identifying himself by badge number and stating plainly that the official report did not reflect what had occurred. The next morning, investigators moved fast. Subpoenas were issued for all body-worn camera footage. GPS logs from the 3 SUVs were pulled. Operational authorization documents were seized. What the data revealed shifted the inquiry from administrative to criminal. The enforcement action that morning had been authorized for a residence 2 streets away, on Alderbrook Lane, targeting an individual with a different name and physical description. The warrant packet contained a precise address that did not match Maple Ridge Court. There was no judicial authorization for Judge Ellison's home. No warrant bearing his name. No probable cause affidavit referencing him. The team had arrived at the wrong location, and instead of verifying, they had escalated. When forensic analysts synchronized the body camera footage with the neighbor recordings, the timeline was undeniable. Ellison had immediately identified himself. His hands had remained visible. There was no resistance. The phrase, "stop resisting," appeared nowhere supported by visual evidence. Most damaging of all was the moment captured clearly on Rourke's chest camera. Him holding the judicial ID badge inches from his face, reading it, pausing, and then saying, "Continue the search." That clip, once reviewed by federal prosecutors, altered the trajectory of the case entirely. By the end of the week, Rourke was placed on unpaid suspension. 2 participating agents were reassigned pending investigation. The field supervisor who had taken Rourke's phone call that morning was interviewed under oath regarding what he had been told, while a federal judge stood in handcuffs. The U.S. Attorney's Office impaneled a grand jury. The potential charges were severe: deprivation of rights under color of law, assault on a federal officer, falsification of federal records, obstruction of justice. What had begun as a driveway detention was now a federal criminal inquiry into civil rights violations committed by federal agents themselves. And as the footage circulated quietly among investigators, each frame time-stamped, each command audible, the realization became unavoidable. The mistake was not going to the wrong address. The mistake was choosing force over verification, authority over law, and then attempting to rewrite the truth after cameras had already captured it. 8 weeks after the morning that began in a quiet driveway in Bethesda, a federal grand jury returned indictments that would formally end the careers of the agents who had placed Judge Marcus Ellison in handcuffs without a warrant, and what had once been described in an internal memo as a routine field encounter was now titled United States versus Rourke in the docket of the very court system Ellison had served for nearly a decade. The charges against Supervisory Agent Daniel Rourke were sweeping: deprivation of rights under color of law for detaining and searching a federal judicial officer without legal authority, assault for the force used during the arrest, falsification of federal records for the incident report that contradicted video evidence, and obstruction of justice for pressuring a subordinate to sign it. 2 additional agents were charged with conspiracy and false statements. Luis Mendez, the junior officer who had called the Inspector General hotline, was granted immunity in exchange for testimony. The trial began on a Monday morning in a federal courthouse less than 15 miles from Maple Ridge Court. The gallery was full: members of the press, legal scholars, federal employees, and neighbors who had witnessed the arrest. Prosecutors opened with video. They played synchronized body camera footage alongside the cell phone recordings captured by Harold Finch and Dr. Alana Green. On a large screen visible to the jury, they showed Ellison turning slowly with his hands visible. They showed him identifying himself calmly and repeatedly. They showed Rourke gripping his arm, spinning him into the side mirror, pressing him against the HUD. They showed the judicial ID badge held inches from Rourke's face. They let the jury watch the exact moment he said, "Continue the search." There was no raised voice from Ellison, no sudden movement, no resistance. The prosecution paused the footage at key moments, asking agents on the stand to reconcile what they had written in reports with what the camera displayed. The discrepancies were stark. When Luis Mendez testified, his voice was steady but tight. He described the silence in the conference room when the report was drafted. He described saying the account was inaccurate. He described Rourke leaning close and telling him not to jeopardize his future over paperwork. "I signed it," Mendez admitted, "but I knew it wasn't true." The defense argued operational stress, miscommunication, and an honest mistake at the wrong address. They emphasized the fast-moving nature of enforcement operations. But prosecutors dismantled that argument methodically. A mistake, they said, is knocking on the wrong door. A crime is what happens after you realize you are at the wrong door and choose to double down. They highlighted the decision to search after the ID was confirmed. They emphasized the fabricated language in the report, phrases like combative and evasive, unsupported by a single frame of video. Then Judge Ellison took the stand. He did not dramatize. He narrated. The sound of engines before sunrise. The feel of the cuffs tightening. The humiliation of sealed court documents spread across his car. The moment he saw Rourke reading his credentials and understood it would not matter. I have ruled on cases involving unlawful detention, he told the jury. That morning, I experienced it. The courtroom was silent when he stepped down. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on the primary counts against Rourke and convictions on falsification and conspiracy charges for the 2 agents who had co-signed the report. Rourke stood expressionless as the foreperson read the findings. At sentencing, the judge spoke plainly. You were entrusted with federal authority, he said. Instead of upholding the Constitution, you violated it and attempted to conceal that violation. Rourke received 7 years in federal prison. The other agents received shorter sentences and were permanently barred from federal service. The field supervisor was formally censured and removed from command. In the months that followed, Judge Ellison filed a civil rights lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security and the agency responsible for the operation. The case settled for $4.8 million and included mandatory reforms, verified warrant confirmation protocols before residential enforcement actions, independent review of use of force incidents, and external oversight panels to audit field operations. Training modules incorporating the Maple Ridge court footage were introduced at federal law enforcement academies nationwide. Luis Mendez received a formal commendation for integrity under pressure and transferred to a different division. Judge Ellison returned to the bench quietly. He declined interviews and public commentary, but at a judicial conference later that year, he addressed a room of federal judges and law clerks. Authority is not immunity, he said. The Constitution is not self-executing. It depends on the courage of individuals to enforce it, even when doing so costs them. Maple Ridge Court returned to its quiet routines, sprinklers ticking at dawn, porch lights flicking off with the sun, but the events of that morning were not forgotten. The handcuffs had been removed in minutes. The consequences lasted years. And for the agents who chose escalation over verification and deception over accountability, the driveway they blocked became the moment their badges ceased to protect them from the very laws they were sworn to uphold.